We designed the precision router base to fit the Dremel tool and the Fordham tool. The base turns the Dremel tool into my favorite saddle slap router, and it fits our saddle routing jig. You'll find lots more uses for the router base in your shop.
Seems like a good tool. Let's see how much it costs. What? 70 quid? So, like usual, I'm going to have to refuse to pay StewMac's ridiculous prices and build my own Dremel router base and show you how to do it. So here's what I've come up with. It's a... wait. As you can see, it's got a wooden base with a V-slot cut in it, so that the collet and the cutter can come through the bottom. We used a 3/4 inch BSF nut to thread onto the Dremel, so we can attach it to a steel plate. Then we have 4 holes in the plate, with some bolts going through with some nuts, and then we've only got 2 springs to hold the Dremel up in the air. So now I'm going to take you through the steps as I build a proper one. We measured and marked on some steel, and then cut it out with a blunt hacksaw blade, and then filed off the burrs. We have 2 bits of steel plate, 60 by 90mm, 4 M5 bolts with some wing nuts, and most importantly, the 3/4 inch BSF nut. So to begin, I took my 2 steel sheets and stuck them together with double-sided tape. What I then did is took the bolt and placed it where I thought it looked the right distance in from the corner, measured that distance, and then used a square to mark the line all the way around. Now you can see in the corners the 2 lines cross over, so I can now punch and drill my holes, and all 4 bolts will be exactly the same distance in from the edge. Now I unstick them and mark them to keep them in orientation. Now that I have 2 identical steel sheets, I'm going to make the top one. After punching the centre, I could set a scribe to do a 3/8 radius, so I'd have a 3/4 inch diameter for the hole for the Dremel. I don't have a 3/4 inch drill bit, so what I did was mark a smaller hole, and then use a centre punch so that I could mark, and then drill out lots of little holes, so the edges of the holes would just be on the outside of the line. I was hoping that this 1/2 inch drill bit would make most of the material fall out. It's still inside the line just. Yeah, I know. Well, that kind of failed. And once I finally got to grips with using this carbide burr, I could grind most of it out with a power drill, and then just finish it off with a round file. So now all I have to do for the piece of steel on the bottom is countersink the hole so that the bolts won't come through the bottom and cause it not to be flat. And then, after marking and punching the centre, it was time to do some more dodgy drilling. Hooray! Ready! Well, it worked out in the end. And now all I have to do is use a hacksaw to cut a V-slot so that I can actually see what I'm routing. Time for assembly. Now I first thought that I could just put the bolt in the hole and then put the plate on and just use the springs to hold the top plate in the Dremel up. But as you can see, even without the Dremel, the structure is all wibbly wobbly. So I went to buy some more N5 nuts. And I also found some of these washers that work really well like spacers. I could put these over the bolts and then thread on my new nuts. With the nuts now tightened down, the bolts were held firmly in place to give an extremely rigid structure. Now I could put my springs on the opposite corner bolts, and for the other 2, just thread on another 2 nuts. In hindsight though, the springs didn't really do anything at all, so you may as well just use nuts on each bolt, so that when you tighten down the wing nut, it clamps the steel plate onto the nut below, holding it firmly in place. Now all I had to do was bolt the Dremel on and see if it worked. Sadly though, the bit protrudes out the bottom about 12mm, which is far too far. I found that this wooden plate would work perfectly to stick on the bottom, so I lined it up and then marked where the slot goes and cut it out on my bandsaw. I now checked that it fit, checked that the bit would no longer protrude out the bottom, and then masked off most of the areas. I can now stick them both together using some spray adhesive, peel off the tape, and once I'd cleaned off the threads with some white spirit, the structure was now complete. For my first test, I set the bit about 2mm out, and this is the sound of the tiny bit snapping off. So I tried again with a very shallow depth, and I'd only achieved this. It was rather boring and quite hard work to do. This is where the bit is far too small to do anything really useful like a nut slot. So I took a plectrum and then cut out a capital J. I superglued it down and scribed round it, and now I could start trying to route it out. I have to use a torch on my piece of wood like this because the wooden base of the Dremel actually causes its own shadow that stops me from seeing anything. After doing a very shallow cut, I moved my nuts down a bit, tightened up the wing nut until it clamped it down, and then continued routing. And here is yet again the sound of the bit breaking off where I'd set my depth of cut a bit too deep. It had all become a bit tedious, and because of this I'd gone over the edge of the line on every single side, and it wasn't really deep enough, but I couldn't be bothered to try again, so I stuck it in with some super glue, rubbed some more sawdust onto the glue to hopefully fill in the gaps, and then sanded it off. The plastic looks a bit scuffed where it hasn't been polished, but other than that it doesn't look too bad. Because it was so tedious, it's unlikely that I use this in another project, but please subscribe and join me next week to see what I do instead.